There are moments in life when even the strongest voices begin to shake. When the people who once carried millions through their darkest nights suddenly face a darkness of their own. For more than 40 years, Pastor Rick Warren was a symbol of hope, a spiritual lighthouse whose words could steady any storm. His sermons crossed oceans, his books changed lives, and his message shaped generations. But behind the global influence, the public admiration, and the best-selling books, a hidden battle was unfolding, one that would test every part of him. Pain, loss, and a silent illness slowly began tearing at the man who had dedicated his life to holding others together. Who was Rick Warren when the lights were gone? What happened when the very man who taught the world how to find purpose began losing control of his own body and heart? The story of Rick Warren does not begin with fame or recognition. It begins far away from bright stages in a quiet California town where a young boy watched faith not as performance, but as a way of life. Rick Warren's journey began long before he ever stepped onto a stage or wrote a single word that would change the world. Born Richard Dwayne Warren on January 28, 1954, in San Jose, California, he was raised in the peaceful town of Ukiah, a place known not for megachurches or movements, but for vineyards, quiet streets, and families who lived simply. His father, Jimmy Warren, was a humble Baptist minister, a man with calloused hands, gentle eyes, and a heart that beat for service. He wasn't famous, and he never tried to be. He built churches the way other men build houses, brick by brick, roof by roof, traveling from one small town to another to help congregations too poor to hire help. Rick often watched him work under the sun, sweating, smiling, praying. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't grand, but it was real. His mother, Dot Warren, was a librarian, soft-spoken, thoughtful, endlessly patient. She nurtured in him a deep love for books and an unshakable curiosity about the world. From her, he learned that the greatest leaders are first great listeners. Their home was simple, no spotlight, no pretense, just faith lived honestly, meal by meal, prayer by prayer. As a child, Rick would sit quietly and listen to his father pray late at night. One evening, he overheard his father whisper through tears, "Lord, help me build one more church before I die." That short, trembling sentence carved itself into Rick's heart. He would carry it for the rest of his life. In school, he wasn't the loudest, the most athletic, or the most popular, but he had something far more powerful: direction. While others drifted between teenage distractions, Rick devoured books on theology, leadership, and scripture. By senior year, he wasn't just reading, he was leading. He organized Bible studies, mentored classmates, and in 1972 founded the Fishers of Men Club, the first Christian group on his high school campus. It was a bold step during a turbulent era of cultural change, but Rick's life had never been about blending in. It was about answering a calling that was growing louder each year. After graduating high school, Rick Warren stepped into a chapter that would shape everything he would one day become. He enrolled at California Baptist University in Riverside, earning his Bachelor of Arts. Those years were transformative, not because they handed him a diploma, but because they sharpened his faith and clarified his mission. Then came a moment he would remember for the rest of his life. In November 1973, Rick and a friend skipped classes, climbed into a car, and drove 350 miles just to hear the legendary Baptist pastor W.A. Criswell speak at the Jack Tar Hotel in San Francisco. After the sermon, Rick waited in a long line simply to shake the pastor's hand. But when he finally reached the front, something unexpected happened. Criswell placed both hands on Rick's head and prayed over him, saying, "I feel led to pray for you. You're going to make a difference for God." That moment struck Rick like lightning, a divine confirmation, a voice of destiny speaking through a stranger. From there, Rick pursued deeper theological training. He earned a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in 1979, followed by a Doctor of Ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary. But his calling didn't come from degrees. It came from conviction. While his classmates sought stable salaries and positions in established congregations, Rick felt something different stirring in him, an ache, a vision, a whisper that told him he wasn't meant to take over an existing church. He was meant to build one from the ground up. Not a church for the already faithful, but a home for the lost, the skeptical, the hurt, the ones who had walked away from religion, believing there was nothing left for them. And so, in 1980, with his young wife, Kay, and everything they owned packed into a U-Haul truck, Rick drove toward Orange County, toward uncertainty, toward possibility, toward purpose. No congregation, no salary, no building, only faith. And that was enough. Arriving in Orange County with nothing but conviction, Rick Warren didn't start his ministry in the way most pastors did. There were no pews waiting for him, no committee eager to welcome him, no building with his name on the sign. Instead, Rick walked door to door, thousands of them, asking strangers one simple but revealing question: why don't you go to church? The answers came like a wave. It's boring. It feels irrelevant. I don't belong there. No one understands my life. Instead of dismissing these responses, Rick wrote them down, studied them, let them shape his vision. These voices of the unchurched became the blueprint for a new kind of a spiritual community, one built not on tradition, but in compassion and relevance. And then came Easter Sunday, April 6, 1980, the day everything changed. In the small little theater at Laguna Hills High School, Rick and Kay held their very first service. They didn't know what to expect, but that morning, 205 people showed up, many of them attending church for the first time in years or ever. Rick's message that day was titled "A Daring Faith." It wasn't just a sermon, it was a beginning. From that simple gathering, Saddleback Church was born, not as a monument of stained glass and steeples, but as a movement built on real stories, real struggles, and real hope. The years that followed were anything but easy. Saddleback had no permanent home, no sanctuary, no stability. Rick and his team became what they jokingly called a church with wheels. Every Sunday before dawn, volunteers unloaded folding chairs, sound systems, children's ministry supplies, transforming gyms, school auditoriums, community centers, and even tents into places of worship. And after each service, they packed it all up again. It was exhausting. It was unpredictable. It was faith in motion. We didn't have a building, Rick once said, but we had a vision, and that was enough. By 1993, after 13 years of wandering from place to place, Saddleback finally built its first permanent worship center in Lake Forest. But the true triumph wasn't the building itself. It was the journey, the endurance, and the belief that something small could grow into something world-changing. Over 10,000 people were now attending weekly, and this was only the beginning. By the mid-1990s, Saddleback was no longer just a fast-growing church. It was a spiritual movement reshaping how people understood faith, community, and purpose. Rick Warren's sermons were conversational, practical, and deeply human. He didn't preach from a pedestal. He spoke like a friend who understood pain, relationships, and the hidden battles people carried. Then, in 1995, Rick released a book that would quietly spark a global shift, The Purpose-Driven Church. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. Every church, big or small, should be built around 5 biblical purposes: worship, fellowship, discipleship, ministry, and mission. When churches focused on these essentials, Rick believed growth would be the natural result. Pastors everywhere resonated with the message. In just a few years, over 200,000 church leaders around the world were trained in the purpose-driven model. Rick's influence stretched far beyond Southern California. But none of this compared to what happened next. On October 1st, 2002, Rick published The Purpose-Driven Life. Unlike his previous work, this wasn't written for pastors. It was written for ordinary people wrestling with the deepest question any human can ask. What on earth am I here for? Structured as a 40-day spiritual journey, the book offered clarity, comfort, and direction in a world drowning in distraction. And something extraordinary happened. Within months, it sold over 1 million copies. Within 3 years, over 20 million. By 2020, the number surpassed 50 million, reaching readers in 85 languages. It became the best-selling hardcover nonfiction book in U.S. history. The impact was undeniable. Michael Phelps, the Olympic champion, read it during rehab. He said it saved his life. Ashley Smith, held hostage during a violent standoff, read it aloud to her captor, helping her survive. Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama quoted it in speeches, but what shocked people most wasn't the book's success. It was Rick's response to it. Instead of upgrading his life, Rick reverse-tithed, giving away 90% of his income and returning 25 years of salary to Saddleback. He and Kay kept living in the same modest home they always had. "I didn't write the book to make money," Rick said. "I wrote it to make a difference." At a time when many spiritual leaders were criticized for luxury and excess, Rick's quiet generosity made him stand out. His humility became his strongest testimony. Saddleback grew to over 20,000 weekly attendees, with campuses across the globe and online services reaching millions. Rick had become one of the most influential pastors in modern history. Yet behind the expanding ministry, something else was happening, something darker, quieter, and far more painful. Rick Warren, the man who taught the world how to find purpose, was so slowly being crushed by the weight of exhaustion, global expectations, and the hidden burdens of leadership. And soon a tragedy would shatter his world in a way no achievement could ever mend. For decades, Rick and Kay Warren's marriage had carried the marks of perseverance. They had survived emotional wounds, financial stress, and years of struggle that could have torn any couple apart. Through prayer, counseling, and raw determination, they rebuilt what life had once threatened to break. They believed they had endured their hardest storms, but nothing could prepare them for April 5th, 2013, a date that would carve itself into their souls. Their youngest son, Matthew, had been battling mental illness from childhood. Long before he grew into adulthood, he fought a darkness few could understand. Even as a little boy, he would ask his parents heartbreaking questions. Why can't I be normal? Why can't I stop hurting? Despite the best doctors, medication, therapies, and constant love, Matthew lived with relentless depression, an invisible storm that followed him everywhere, and yet he was compassionate, tender, and deeply empathetic. He volunteered at church. He reached for people in pain. He loved Jesus sincerely. But even faith could not silence the torment inside him. On that spring evening, Matthew spent time with his parents. He laughed, he talked, he acted like everything was normal. But later that night, overwhelmed by despair that no one could see coming, Matthew took his own life. He was 27 years old. Rick would later describe the moment he learned the news as anguished grief beyond words. In an email to the Saddleback congregation, he wrote, "Our youngest son, Matthew, was an incredibly kind, gentle, and compassionate young man. He had a brilliant mind and a gift for sensing who was in pain. But he struggled from birth with mental illness, and in spite of America's best doctors, meds, and prayers, the torture of mental illness never subsided. The world reacted with shock. Millions mourned with them. But not everyone responded with kindness. Some critics weaponized their loss, cruelly questioning Rick and Kay's faith. Some even blamed them. Yet even in unimaginable grief, Rick chose grace over anger. When people asked him why God didn't heal Matthew, Rick answered, "He did heal Matthew, just not on this side of eternity." It was the voice of a man shattered, yet still anchored to hope, still believing, still trusting, still choosing faith over bitterness. Matthew's death became a wound that would never fully close, but it also became the turning point that reshaped Rick's ministry, his message, and his mission forever. After Matthew's passing, the Warren home fell into a silence deeper than words could hold. For months, Rick and Kay stepped away from the pulpit, unable to preach through the rawness of their grief. The world saw a respected pastor mourning his son, but behind closed doors, Rick was a father trying to breathe again. 4 months later, with trembling courage, he returned to Saddleback Church, not with polished sermons, not with triumphant declarations, but with honesty. He began a new series titled How to Get Through What You're Going Through. It was unlike anything he had ever preached. The pain was visible in his voice. The vulnerability was unmistakable. Take your greatest sorrow, Rick told his congregation, and turn it into your life's greatest message. Instead of hiding Matthew's struggle with mental illness, Rick and Kay spoke openly about it, shattering the silence that surrounded mental health in Christian communities. For decades, churches had been places where depression was misunderstood, where anxiety was oversimplified, where mental illness was often dismissed as a lack of faith. Rick and Kay refused to let Matthew's story end that way. Together, they launched the Hope for Mental Health initiative, creating programs, partnerships, and resources for families suffering in silence. Kay became a powerful advocate for compassion-based care, helping churches become safe spaces instead of judgmental ones. Thousands of families reached out. Some wrote letters, some shared stories, some simply said, "Thank you for saying what we couldn't." Rick received over 10,000 letters from people living in darkness who finally felt seen. He often repeated a truth he learned the hardest way possible. You can love Jesus and still battle depression. But while Rick poured himself into healing others, something unexpected began happening inside his own body, a quiet enemy, a hidden battle, a physical storm he could not pray away. And soon it would change the course of his life forever. As Rick Warren worked tirelessly to comfort others, a silent battle was tightening its grip on his own body. For years, He pushed through fatigue, ignoring the aches and tremors creeping into his daily life, but eventually the truth could no longer be hidden. His body was failing him in ways he couldn't control. In 2021, Rick revealed that he had been diagnosed with spinal myoclonus, a rare neurological disorder that causes violent, uncontrollable muscle spasms. Each spasm felt like being struck from the inside, sharp, sudden, unpredictable. For a pastor who preached multiple services every weekend, it was devastating. Adrenaline, something preaching naturally triggered, made the spasms worse. Some nights, Rick barely slept at all. His back twitched for hours, leaving him exhausted and in constant pain. But the worst wasn't over. Doctors soon discovered a mysterious neurological condition, informally called Warren syndrome, a disorder that prevented Rick's body from processing adrenaline correctly. Instead of giving him energy, adrenaline left him, trembling, disoriented, dizzy, overwhelmed by physical weakness. Then, in 2022, came another blow. Rick was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease that caused chronic inflammation and intense muscle pain, 24 hours a day. Every movement hurt. Every sermon became a battle. The man who had spent his life lifting others now struggled to lift himself. Rick once said, "When I don't talk my emotions out to God, I take them out on my body." And now his body was bearing the weight of decades of leadership, loss, and emotional strain. He tried to push through, he tried to endure, but the pain only grew deeper. And then came the hardest decision of all. In June 2021, after 41 years of leading the church he founded, Rick Warren announced his retirement as senior pastor of Saddleback Church. The news stunned millions. The man who had built one of the most influential churches in the world, the man whose book changed global Christianity, the man who had become a mentor to pastors across continents, was stepping down because his body could no longer carry the calling it once bore with ease. Yet even in this heartbreaking moment, Rick stood before his congregation with his voice steady and full of faith. "This is not the end of the story," he said. "It's the beginning of the beginning." When Rick Warren announced his retirement, Saddleback Church felt a collective shock. For more than 4 decades, he had been their shepherd, their mentor, their steady voice. It was hard to imagine Saddleback without Rick in the pulpit. But Rick knew something the world would soon understand. Great leaders don't cling to their positions. They prepare for what comes after them. In 2021, Rick and Kay passed the mantle of leadership to Andy Wood, a young pastor from San Jose, and his wife, Stacy. The transition was emotional, hopeful, and, like all major leadership shifts, surrounded by questions and controversy. Some critics doubted the choice. Others worried the church would lose its identity or drift from its roots. But after a thorough investigation, Saddleback affirmed Andy Wood as the right leader to carry the church into its next season. Rick stepped aside with humility, not bitterness, with gratitude, not fear, with confidence, not regret. He embraced a new role as founding pastor, focusing on global outreach through his lifelong passion, the Finishing the Task movement, a coalition dedicated to spreading the gospel to every remaining people group on earth. Even outside the spotlight, Rick's influence stretched across continents. Meanwhile, Saddleback continued to grow. New leaders, new seasons, new chapters, but the foundation Rick built, one constructed through tears, triumphs, and unwavering faith, remained unshaken. In the years following his retirement, Rick spoke with a new kind of voice, not the energized tone of a young pastor building a movement, but the measured, compassionate voice of a man who had lived through suffering, loss, success, illness, and deep spiritual transformation. He often said, "Everybody needs recovery because nobody's perfect." And he meant it. He had lived it. Rick Warren's legacy isn't found in book sales, media appearances, or the size of Saddleback Church. It's found in lives changed, marriages restored, addicts freed, broken hearts healed, and millions of people discovering their purpose, many for the first time. Yet even as he stepped back from public ministry, one truth remained. Rick Warren's story was far from over. Even in retirement, Rick Warren's influence continues to echo around the world, reaching far beyond the walls of Saddleback, beyond the pages of his books, and beyond the sermons that once filled stadiums. His journey, marked by both extraordinary impact and unimaginable pain, has become a living testimony to the complexity of faith. He never claimed perfection. He never hid his grief. He never pretended that faith makes life easy. Instead, Rick taught the world something far more powerful. Faith does not erase suffering. Faith gives you the strength to walk through it. The ministries he launched continue to save lives. The Peace Plan, transforming communities across the globe. The HIV/AIDS Initiative, offering compassion to the marginalized. The Hope for Mental Health Ministry, giving dignity to the suffering. Saddleback Church, once a tiny gathering in a high school theater, now reaches tens of thousands every week across continents. And The Purpose-Driven Life, his quiet, reflective book, remains one of the most influential spiritual works ever written, changing millions of lives with a simple opening line, "It's not about you." Rick's life today is quieter. He speaks less frequently. His body bears the scars of illness and decades of carrying others. But his words carry a deeper weight than ever before. He has lost a son. He has battled invisible diseases. He has felt the sting of public criticism and the ache of private suffering. And yet he still believes. He still hopes. He still trusts in the God who walked with him through every valley. Rick Warren once wrote, "You were made by God and for God, and until you understand that, life will never make sense." His story asks each of us a question we cannot ignore. Do you believe that even your deepest pain can still have purpose? If Rick's journey moved you, if his resilience touched your heart, or if his story reminded you that you are not alone, then please share your thoughts below. And if you want more stories of courage, faith, and the hidden battles behind extraordinary lives, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs hope today.